Hello, I am Michael Gold, and I want to return to some of the items I talked about in my introduction to ethics. We began talking about metaphysics, and I am convinced we cannot intelligently speak about ethics until we speak first about metaphysics. Metaphysics is what is reality, what's out there, and until we know what's really out there, what is reality, we cannot decide what is right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. We talked about two different opinions, dualism versus monism. Dualism says there's two substances, two realities. There's mind and body. Most of us are dualists. If you grow up in a Christian or Jewish home, you're probably a dualist. You believe you have a body and you believe you have a soul. The body works by certain natural laws. The soul has free will. But there's also monism. Monism says there's one reality, and some monists say that only reality is mind. If you were a Buddhist or a Hindu, you would probably be a idealistic monist. But a lot of Westerners are monists, materialists. They believe there's one reality, and that's material, and material things work by natural law. And if you're going to say that all there is material things that work by natural law, you're almost forced to say, therefore, everything's determined. It's all determined by the laws of physics, the laws of biology. Even your behavior is determined. A classical example is the example of Leopold and Loeb, two young men who decided to try to get away with murder. And they killed the teenage boy just to see if they could get away with it. They were caught. They were put on trial. Their attorney who defended them was Clarence Darrow. And Clarence Darrow tried to prove that they had no control, that they were the victims of their brain and the way their brain worked, of their upbringing, and therefore it was all predetermined that they would do this, and therefore they should not be held responsible. And Darwin partially convinced the judge, who took away the death penalty and limited the punishment that they would have. So that's determinism. Another case of determinism was the case that's sometimes called the Twinkie defense. This was the killing of George Moscone and Harvey Milk, the mayor and a supervisor in San Francisco. They made a very well-received movie out of this called Milk. Dan White was the murderer, and he claimed that he couldn't control himself. He was the victim of too much sugary food, too many Twinkies. The Twinkie defense. You can't really talk about ethics if you're a pure determinist, because determinism says that everything you do has been pre-decided. And ethics is based on the idea that we have free will, which means we have a mind, we're more than matter. So I think that's the first big question that we have to accept if we're going to deal with ethics. The second question of metaphysics is reality constantly changing, or is there a fixed absolute reality? Heraclitus said you can't step into the same river twice, it's constantly changing. Parmenides said if you think about it using your mind, you can't have something from nothing. If there was change, then something would come from nothing. So there is no such thing as real change. Change is an illusion. Notice that Parmenides used his mind. Heraclitus used his senses, looking at a river. If you use your senses to get information, that's called empiricism. If you use your mind, that's called rationalism. And the argument between empiricism and rationalism is going to be one of the most basic arguments that we're going to go through as we study ethics. Empiricism says that we can learn ethics using our senses. We look out in the world and we learn ethics. David Hume is later on going to say that's impossible. He's going to say you cannot learn an ought from an is. Looking out in the world, we learn is. What is out there? We learn science. But we cannot learn ought. What ought we to do? Science cannot teach us ethics. However, there's going to be a group known as the utilitarians who are going to try to scientifically come up with ethical arguments. On the other hand, Parmenides was a rationalist. Later, Plato would become a rationalist. And Plato would say that what we see is an illusion. The world that we see is merely the reflection on a wall in a cave. But if we were to move out of the cave, we could see something called the eternal forms that are unchangeable. And ethics takes the form of these eternal forms. There is absolute eternal goodness, and absolute eternal piety, and absolute eternal justice. And we could reach those with our minds. So ethics, we use our mind. Ethics is based on rationalism according to Plato. Later on, Immanuel Kant is going to come up with something called deontology, which says there are certain things we know with our mind, including basic ethical questions. So utilitarianism is based on empiricism. Deontology is based on rationalism. And that's a fight that's going to take us right through to our present day. But let's go back once again to Plato. Plato said we are like prisoners in a cave. It's an allegory. And if we could only get out of the cave and make it into the world of the forms, we could see absolute right and absolute wrong and the absolute forms that are unchangeable. We could do that with our mind. But we need to leave the cave. I want to introduce one more philosopher now, and that was Aristotle. Aristotle was Plato's student, but he totally disagreed with Plato. Aristotle said that we don't look up to the world of the forms. We look down to the real world. We look down to what we can see with our senses. We look down to actual objects in the world. There's a very famous painting called The School of Athens. You can see it in Rome. It was by the Renaissance painter Raphael, and it shows all the great sages of Athens. And in the center are Plato and Aristotle. Plato's an older man. He's pointing up as if he's pointing to the world of the forms. Aristotle's pointing down as if he's pointing to the real world. We could say that Plato, in his own way, was a rationalist. Aristotle, in his own way, was an empiricist, although those terms were not used until much later, until the Middle Ages. But how do we learn ethics? Do we learn it with our mind? Do we learn it with our senses? Are we rationalists? Are we empiricists? And that's going to be one of the great debates that's going to take us through this class as we study ethics together.